So we'll start with this compost training with selecting feedstocks. Now, I don't know if you guys know this, but every single feedstock has its own carbon to nitrogen ratio. So what we want to do is we want to have 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen for the optimal composting. So if you take a look at corrugated cardboard, it's 600 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. You're going to need far less of that to get to your 30 to 1 than, let's say, if you use straight up leaves, which are only 60 to 1. So when you're starting to mix your feedstocks, you take a look at these and really try to get to that 30 to 1 ratio. So when selecting feedstocks, it's important to try to get to that ratio. Basically, as a rule of thumb, you can start out with 4 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen as a basic recipe, and then just adjust as you go. Technically, you're going to need a lot more carbon in your pile than you do nitrogen, because the ratio is 30 to 1. So if you're doing, let's say you're doing shredded leaves, you're going to need a lot more shredded leaves than you are food waste or grass clippings. So you'll want to start with 3 parts of your carbon, add 1 part nitrogen, and see how that works if you're not interested in using the equation. And then if it starts stinking, if it's not breaking down, you can add more carbon. 9 times out of 10, if your compost stinks, you need to add carbon. That will usually solve the vast majority of compost problems. Mixing it too is important. So sometimes you'll get pockets of methane generation if it's not mixed real well. If you have a clump of grass clippings that's quite big in the middle, that will smell pretty bad after a couple days. So you want to mix it in really well to avoid odors. The other thing, no fats, oils, grease, dairy, meats. That'll bring in all the vermin, vectors to start eating from your pile. Pigs, if you're composting pigs, or you got to cover those really well so the birds of prey don't smell it. So anyway, back to mixing. So once you have your pile, your feedstocks, you want to mix it really, really well initially so that you don't have pockets of methane generating. And a lot of people think that when you mix your compost pile, the reason you do it is to introduce air to the pile, and that's just simply not true, because when you mix it, the air that you've introduced into your pile will only last for about 20 minutes before it dissipates. So that we don't do it for air, we do it so that it's uniformly mixed and the microbes can travel throughout without pockets of methane generation and potential odors. So mixing isn't as important as a lot of people think. A lot of people think, oh, you have to mix it every 3 days. I had a lot of success with my own compost pile, and I mixed it, I'd say, once a week initially, and then after that, very rarely did I mix it at home. So mixing, I don't think, is as important throughout, just the initial making sure everything's mixed together. As you add food or grass clippings or carbon to your pile, you want to mix it initially, but it's okay to let it sit. If your pile stops generating heat, try mixing it. If it's winter, don't mix it at all. Winter, if you mix your compost pile, if you're able to, a lot of times they're frozen, but you'll introduce ambient air temperatures into the pile and lose your heat. So in the winter, I wouldn't mix it at all.
But it's okay to keep adding.
Absolutely. It's okay to keep adding. Once springtime rolls around, though, you got to keep a close eye on it, because once it starts to warm up, you'll see the steam rolling off your pile. You want to make sure that you mix it in the spring when it's thawed, and check the temperatures so you don't have a fire in your pile. If it's big, you could have a fire. So in the spring, when it starts steaming, is a great time to mix it. But mine sits all winter. So you need to keep moisture in your pile. The optimal moisture content is 40 to 60%, and there is a super simple way to gauge that, and I'm going to show you how. Actually, I'll have Jason do it because I'm tethered by this microphone.
So the easiest way, unless you have a moisture measuring tool, is to pick up a clump of your compost. And as you can see, when you squeeze this, it's very dry. There's no moisture coming out at all. And then we'll add a little bit of water. And what you're looking for is when you squeeze it, you want maybe 2 to 3 drops coming out, not very many. You don't want your hand to be saturated with water.
But that's about perfect. So that's 40 to 60% moisture. Super easy test. You don't need to buy a meter. This is what you can do. A lot of times when you water your compost, it just rolls right off the top. It's really hard to get it into the middle. Composting is an aerobic process to break down materials into this wonderful soil amendment. So we need air in there to keep the microbes alive. Like I mentioned before, mixing it is not a great way to introduce air for the long haul. So you want to have a pile that air can go into. So one of the great ways to do this is to select the right carbon source. If you have wood chips that are about this big, and you mix various sizes of carbon in with your nitrogen, your food waste, your grass clippings, that will promote airflow. You just need to have different sizes of material and kind of mix it up a little bit. So another method to get air into your pile is to lay down wood chips on your surface where you're going to compost, and then start composting right on top of the wood chips. Because as your pile warms up, air is going to go in because the pile is pulling in air from the bottom, and then as it heats, it rises and will dissipate through your pile. So wood chips on the base are a great idea. Another thing you could do is put a perforated pipe through the middle of your pile. That will also help draw air up with the wood chips on the bottom. So those are 2 great ways. If you don't have like a blower and electricity and want to push air through it, then you can simply just use wood chips and a perforated pipe. So then we have to talk about temperature. Temperature is really another important thing. You want your compost pile, while it's actively breaking down, to be at 135 to 165 degrees. You want your pile at least 131 degrees for 3 consecutive days at least to kill pathogens and weed seeds. If you don't maintain that temperature for at least 3 days, then those pathogens and weed seeds will not be killed. So the heat is very important when it comes to getting rid of some of the diseased plants that you may have or other pathogens. So that is super important. Once a compost pile gets hotter than 165 degrees, you run the risk of a fire. And then we're going to discuss curing. So curing is very important in a compost pile. If you use it too soon, there are gases in there that could be harmful to your plants. A great way to test your compost is to do what's called a bioassay test. And you just take a handful of your compost and plunk a few radish seeds in there, put it in a sunny window, and then observe how the radish seeds grow. If they grow great, it's ready. A lot of people are perfectly fine with just the sniff test. If it smells like dirt, it should be good to use. But it depends on your intended use. If you're going to sell it or give it to someone who has valuable plants, you want to make sure that it's ready to use. If you're composting in your backyard, the chances are it's going to take up to a year for that compost to be completed. If you're going to do it here and you have a big enough pile, it might not take that long. When you're composting, you want at least 3 cubic yards in size to maintain heat. And I would say that is about this wide by this tall, this wide of a circle by about this tall. So it's pretty big and significant. We were working with Elkader School District, and they were composting the food waste from the cafeteria, and it wasn't breaking down, and they were running out of room. And when I went to help them troubleshoot it, they had about 8 piles, and they were all about this tall. So I was like, they're not breaking down because there's no heat. So You can still compost in the winter, but like I said, you just don't want to mix it, or even add water for that matter, because it'll just freeze. And then let's talk about limiting odors. Odors is a big issue. My compost pile in my backyard doesn't give off any bad odors that would offend my neighbors. But if you do have odors, like I said before, try to add carbon to it and mix it up. That should help it. But then keep the fats, oils, meats, and dairies out of it that get really smelly. Grass clippings get really smelly too. Make sure those are well incorporated into your pile, and that will help with the prevent the odors. And then we're going to run through a really cool gauge right now. So we talked about fires and compost piles, but one thing that's really important to measure is the compaction of your pile. If you're using carbon like sawdust or a shredded newspaper or even leaves, there's not enough particle size distribution throughout the pile that it's going to get really compacted. So compaction can cause a lot of problems. It limits the airflow getting through the pile, and it can also cause odor issues. So there's this test called bulk density, and it's a really easy way to measure the compaction in your pile so you can gauge what you need to add. We're going to run through this test really quick, but I want to point out that this is finished compost. This is not active compost. This test is done on active compost, but since we don't have any, we're just going to run through it with finished compost.
So the way you do this is first you're going to weigh your empty bucket, and that's one of the weights that you add to your equation. But each of these 5-gallon buckets, we have them marked off at 1/3, 2/3, and then the top. So what you're going to do is you're going to fill up to the first 1/3 level, drop it 10 times to compact it down, fill it up to the 2/3 level, do the same again 10 times, compact it down, fill it up to the top, drop it 10 times, and then just loosely fill it up. And then once you have that, you're going to weigh it, and that's going to give you your bulk density. So I'll get to shoveling unless somebody wants to.
Unless someone else wants to do it.
Feel like shoveling, Tim? You don't have to, I'm joking. And then once it's filled up, we weigh it. I'll use this one.
Okay. That's just a luggage scale. They're like 20 bucks. Pretty cheap. $52.75. Okay. So if you look at number 12 on page 7, the weight of the compost in the bucket is 52.75. And then we're going to subtract the weight of the bucket, which is 2.4 pounds. So 50.35 is what I got. So the compost minus the bucket is 50.35 pounds. And on number 12, you just multiply that by 40. I need my calculator for this one. The bulk density is 2,000. We'll round it up to 2,000. So if you look on page 7 at this little text on the side here, it tells you what that number means. So what 2,000 means, anything over 1,200 indicates compaction, and you would want to add a bulking agent, which would be your 1-inch wood chips or something carbon that has a bigger diameter. This is highly compacted, but like I said before, it is finished compost. It's not actively composting. So this is great compost, but this is a measure for while you're composting. Anything less than 800 when you do this calculation indicates that all your moisture will be easily evaporated and you have too little compaction. There's too much fluff in your pile. So you would want to maybe add some shredded leaves, something that would take away all of that air, or at least make it less airous or porous. That's airous isn't a word, but
I like it though.
okay, so now that we've gone over bulk density, we're just going to go right into the next test, which is called the free air space test. This test does exactly what it says. It measures the air within the pile, the air space within the pile. So all you do is you go from your bulk density test and you just fill it with water, and then you weigh it and plug it into an equation. So Jason's going to let this water roll into there. It's going to take a while since it's compacted, but once it's filled, we will weigh it, and then we'll find out what the free air is in that pile. Okay, you're going to weigh that. Okay, this test is on page 8, the calculations. That's heavy, isn't it?
Yeah. 65 pounds.
65. So number 2, I just put in there 65. Okay, so weight of the bucket minus weight of bucket with compost. So we're going to pull some numbers from our previous bulk density test for number 3 on page 8. So the weight of the bucket with compost and water is 65 minus weight of bucket with just compost. That was 52.75. Divided by weight of bucket full of just water minus weight of empty bucket. So we know that water minus the bucket weight is 41.7 pounds. So let me run this through my calculator. So what I got was, I ran through this equation and I got 29%. So like I said before, this is finished compost, but if we were actively composting, we would want 50% free airspace in our pile. However, a range between 30 and 65% is reasonable. Optimal is 50%. This is 29%, which is good for finished compost. So that's how you check the airspace in your compost pile.